practical. So you can roll up your sleeves. We're going to go to our next presentation. That was just kind of a devotional, if you will, and an example of how you might think about in crafting and presenting sermons to make them all about Jesus. No matter what you're talking about, it's all about Him. Okay? So, this section, and you should have in your packet of outlines, you should have a sheet for this. I don't think there's a lot of blanks to fill in, but I would encourage you on the back of it. We're going to spend most of this session going over just a lot of detailed tips that I got from a professional communicator, a PhD in communications, who just served me so nobly and well over the course of 10 years when I was at Walla Walla University, critiquing my sermons. And some of the things that he taught me, oh, beautiful, thank you, continue to shape how I preach. And so I encourage you on the back of the outline to write down anything that might be helpful to you, tips that he gave me. And so we'll get there. But we're going to start with a quote, again, by Haddon Robinson. The effectiveness of our sermons depends on two factors: what we say and how we say it. Right? Both are important. Apart from life-related biblical content, we have nothing worth communicating. But without skillful delivery, we will not get that content across to a congregation. So, if you want to preach an effective sermon, it takes two things: what you say and how you say it. Now, we've been talking a lot yesterday about what you say, how it needs to be Christ-centered, how it needs to be biblical, how it needs to be interesting, and so all of that's part of what we say, and selecting a passage, studying the passage, and then coming up with that big exegetical idea and so on. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, what we say. Then this section, and there's a lot of books about this kind of thing. I find it all very fascinating, how we say it, because we all know that nonverbal communication always trumps verbal communication. If there is a disconnect between what we are saying and what we are doing, we tend to believe what people are doing, right? And there are different studies that give different numbers, but somewhere between 70, 80, 90% even of communication is nonverbal. And so a fairly small percentage of the words you actually speak in the pulpit when you are preaching is what's communicated. And what's really getting communicated is the nonverbal, is what we're not saying. And this has to do with grooming and dress, movement and gestures, eye contact, vocal delivery, effective use of humor, creativity, and so on. Okay? So, I took this basic outline out of Haddon Robinson's book on biblical preaching. And then that's when it struck me that this professor that would critique my sermons regularly talked all the time about this. He functioned more in the business world, coaching, teaching techniques to CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And so that's what he did. He was also a professor of communication, so he didn't tend to talk a whole lot about the theology and the content. That was not so much his role in my life as much as it was just communicating. And so he spent a lot of time. And so I got the idea to go back and grab some of the notes that he took and gave me. And then we would sit down, usually for about an hour. And we would do this every quarter for probably 10 years. Most every quarter we would meet, and then we would discuss the notes that he would take. And sometimes he'd type them up, sometimes he'd write them out, and I still have a lot of those notes. But what made me think of this, to go dig up those notes, is that whenever I preached, he said certain things that now going back, I see that he had written them down, that just stuck with me. And that's what I'm hoping I can share with you, because some of these tips that he gave me, I think are just solid, and they're gold, and they hopefully will be helpful to you. And that's what I'm encouraging you to write on the back. And I'll just give you a couple off the top, and then we'll get into the details. But for example, one thing I remember him telling me is that when I share a story, don't make it one long, run-on sentence. And now, ever since he told me that probably 20 years ago, whenever I listen to a preacher, I realized how so many preachers do this, and it just drives me crazy. I do it sometimes too, I know, but I think about it, and it's just a small detail. So, what he was saying is, he said, when you were telling that story, Sabbath, you connected every sentence with the word "and." Now, it's not a huge deal, and preachers do it all the time, but it does clean up the language if you just drop the ands. So, if you're telling a story, Mom was with her 4-year-old daughter at the supermarket, and they looked up and they saw a big man. And he said to her, you know what I'm saying, you connect everything. And so that was just one of many, many tips he gave me that ever since, I just remember it when I preach. And when I listen to preachers, and their stories are all about, their stories are like one super long sentence because everything's connected with the word "and," it just kind of reminds me, don't do that. It's cleaner if you just tell the story. Mom and her daughter were at the supermarket. She looked up and she saw this very long, large man. Another thing I remember, and this was early on, he said, it's not interesting. Because I said, that's really an interesting thing. It's interesting. It's interesting. And he would point out just, again, minor details, but over the course of 10 years, he was very helpful. He talked a lot about these things that you see up there. Grooming and dress. And as we go through, I'm just going to go through a couple of critiques that he gave me, but you will see a theme of a lot of these things. He was a meticulous dresser, and he would always comment about what I wore. Because, again, he understood that the nonverbal carries a lot of the communication. So how you look, it just makes a difference. He would almost always comment on movement and gestures. Again, understanding how important it was. Almost always he would talk about my eye contact. He said a lot about vocal delivery. And he would want me to go higher pitch and lower pitch. He would like me, he said a lot to me about pace and pausing. So we'll talk about that. So, as his tips to me were helpful, as they might be helpful to you, you might just write them down. And I'll just go through a couple of sermons. This one goes way back, 1998, so this was shortly after I got to Walla Walla University Church. He was a professor when I got there, but when I was a student there, so back in the early 80s. He was a communications professor there for probably 30, 40 years. And the kids, his classes filled up right away, even though the word on campus was you could never get an A. He was really hard. But kids loved his classes. He's just that good. In fact, I think during this part, so I'm talking about critiques, and I think it's helpful if you can find people. I would have people read my sermons first, so a preview of the sermon, and those were theologians from the theology department where they could comment about, are my facts correct in terms of how I'm interpreting Scripture, and is this story factual, and that kind of thing. Preview, and then Dr. Dickinson would be the post-assessment, and that's a picture, fairly recent picture of Dr. Dickinson. So, 1998, January 31, number 1, walked out and got set before speaking. Again, just a very minor point. He would do this, and I tried to do this. Again, nonverbal is so important. When you start, and I do this at Kettering, even though I've been preaching almost every week there for the last 11 years, still walk out and just pause a little bit. I try to count to 5 in my mind, and it just builds a little bit of anticipation. And it communicates that you're in charge, that you're confident in what you're doing. I also like to smile before I say anything. Unless, of course, I'm starting with, kind of a sad story or an alarming statistic or something, and the smile is a little discongruent to what you're about to say. But I always, if I can, I stand there just for a couple of ticks and smile. I'm glad you're here, right? And smile just disarms people, and it just and he was big on that. First words were clear, he said. Appearance credible, not over or underdressed. So again, he just would always comment about stuff like that. Rate a bit deliberate. And he actually went back and timed how many words I was saying a minute in the sermon. And he would often say, speak faster. He said in this particular sermon, you were going 150 to 160 words a minute. He says conversational is 210 words a minute. And he said, we can listen at a rate of 500 to 700 words a minute. And so generally speaking, I think as preachers, your pace can go a lot quicker because we can listen and absorb a lot quicker than somebody can speak. And so when you're going 150 words a minute, and somebody is able to process at 500-600 words a minute, that gives a lot of time for people to think about what they're going to have for lunch, or to wander all over the place. And so, just generally speaking, he would constantly be saying, pick up your pace especially when you're going through, a story or whatever, that we can stay with you. Just go faster, speak faster, and a lot of that is a function of preparedness, which we talked about yesterday, and really knowing the sermons. Note-free virtually the entire time. He liked the fact that I didn't use many notes. He said exclusion, embrace, that was kind of the theme of the sermon, that was the big idea. He says you return to this theme several times. Even more would be fine. So we talked a lot yesterday about having that big idea and making sure you're clear on what your take-home is and what you're trying to say, because if you're fuzzy on that, everybody's going to be wondering what you were talking about. And he points out, yeah, you hit the theme, I got the big idea, but you could reiterate it even more. That would be fine. So let's see here. Have you thought about doing an initial summary, a forecast? And he would talk a lot to me about, he loved forecasts so that people know, and we mentioned this yesterday, that it puts people at ease if you let them know where you're going. And so an initial summary and a forecast, even though I had one, it wasn't as clear as he would have liked. Then he goes on to the next point. He says, is you had one about 11 to 12 minutes in, which is probably too late. You need to let people know a little earlier on in the sermon where you're headed. I feel a need for more feeling on the scripture you read. So here referring to pitch and enthusiasm in reading, and don't allow scripture, which is the core of what you're doing and the core of your message, don't allow that to sort of sag, like you're just reading through it to get through it, and then you're going to get to a fun story, and then your voice comes alive and you come alive. Make sure your nonverbals communicate that this is the holy word of God, and this is why we are here, and we revere scripture, right? So he mentioned that. Let's see, some few pieces of what you said were in the handouts for the day. Good. The ideas were clear. So Dr. Dickinson always seemed to kind of have the perfect balance between critique and criticism and uplifting. I always felt affirmed. And so he would put probably 80% affirmation in his critiques and 20%. I say that because I have had other people through the years who have wanted to serve me in this way, but I found their critiques were just, just so debilitating and discouraging that they were, like 80% negative and 20%. And so he does put in things like, he liked that there's an outline. It's easy for people to follow, and I continue to do an outline, which might be helpful for you to do as well. Now, here's the forecast I heard. With the time that remains, let's look at 3 questions. So that's an example of a good forecast. Now, with the time that remains, this is where we're going to go. We're going to consider 3 questions, even though I should have done it a little earlier in the sermon. Then you posed the question and dealt with them. The first being the longest, try the first being short, the second being longer, and the third being shorter again. So he's saying, think about a bell curve, that if you have 3 points, maybe think about the first point being this long, the second point being this long, and the third point being this long. That balance is maybe a little easier for people to digest. Let's see, the graphics were relevant, easily visible, well taken, and well timed. We haven't talked a lot about the use of media, but if it's helpful to communicate, then use PowerPoint or video or whatever. But if it gets in the way, then obviously don't. Generally, I think you could speed up the rate a bit. So he put this a few times in this one critique, that he wants me to talk faster. Good eye contact, both the sides and the center. It was a large church that could seat 2,300 people. So eye contact, he's saying, the sides, you were paying attention there, and so on. Did you oversimplify the counselor's role about you matter to me illustration? So he would ask questions about specific parts of the sermon. Some well-placed and well-timed pauses. Let's talk about making them even more dramatic. This is something he would talk about often. Pretty much every time we got together, he would talk about pauses and how important pauses are. And the thing he would keep coaching me on was to say, pause, and when you feel like it's just uncomfortable, it's way too long, that's probably about right. So it should feel a pause, especially in a story. A pause should be longer than you feel comfortable with. Pausing is a powerful tool in oratory and communicating. So use pauses. When you ask a question that you want people to really wrestle with, just wait until you feel uncomfortable, like, oh, I gotta talk, I gotta fill the space. You're in charge, just pause. Or in a dramatic point of a story, just let that pause linger. So my brother went to the highest part of the roof, and just let people wonder, oh, it's not a jump. So yeah, pausing. Some of your best gestures are palms out and arms outstretched. He liked this gesture. He always paid careful attention to whatever gestures I might use in sermons. I remember him telling me once, I did this. I had my hands behind my back. He said, well, it's not a terrible gesture, but the energy is then going behind you. So it's not a great gesture to use a lot. So just thinking about some of these details that I just would never think about. He says, your humor worked. You enjoyed it a bit, not too much. You enjoyed it, but not too much. And it's several cuts above cheesy or corny. So I remember him telling me, and this is something I often think about all these years later again, when you say something that's obviously just fun or funny, smile. I remember him saying, just smile, or kind of, don't laugh at your own joke, but communicate non-verbally that, yeah, this is funny, and so you just smile, and that communicates a lot. I noticed that you take rather ordinary examples and provide a fit with your rhetoric good. Well, we were talking about illustrations yesterday and where you get things. Somebody mentioned that some of the most ordinary illustrations are the most powerful. I looked up this sermon because I have a record of the manuscript of what illustrations he was talking about. And yeah, it was a very simple illustration of a kid saying, what do you remember most vividly of your childhood? And he said, I remember mowing the lawn with my dad and hanging on to the middle part of the mower, and my dad's big arms around me, and together we were pushing. You think about just how simple that is, and yet how profound it is. It's true, illustrations that just give you a simple word picture like that can be very, very powerful, because it speaks to the connection between a father and his son, and the fact that when you ask him, tell me your story, that's the first story that comes to mind. Mowing the lawn with his dad. Very simple. Voice once more. Could use peaks into the upper ranges more often, I'm sensing. Again, variety of pitch. He regularly was working with me to get it wider, higher pitch, lower pitch, longer pauses, faster when you're not pausing, but vocal variety is big on that. I felt the final line could still be stronger. All of us have to decide the words to that effect. Your movements on the platform are casual, smooth, not attractive to themselves, good. The basic principle on movement is that the movement should communicate. I remember Dr. Dickinson telling me that if you're going to kind of preach a sermon, it's best to, if you're going to move in the sermon, and he definitely wanted me to move, but always the movement has to have purpose. Don't just be a talking head, but don't have useless movement. Another thing I remember him saying is movement always wins, and you probably noticed this. As you're preaching, if somebody gets up and walks out, you notice pretty much everybody watches the person, right? Movement always wins. Again, it's nonverbal, but so when you are moving as you are preaching, he said it's good to think about the way we read, which is from left to right in a book. And so, as you're preaching a sermon, I try to think about, okay, start maybe over here on your left, and then so maybe point one is here. Now, if you have a stationary mic, you can't really do that. But, this would be point one, and then maybe here, point two, and if that's the longest point that you make, then it's good that you're in the center, perhaps, and then point three over here. And then when you are moving, make sure it's at a thoughtful point, and there's a reason for the movement. Otherwise, it's just distracting, and it non-verbally communicates something, whatever, that you're not really intending to communicate. And then he says, your preaching is thoughtful, elevating, pertinent, engaging, and generally clear. So again, just generally speaking, he was always very positive and very hopeful. And his criticism was always, I just knew he was on my side. He was for me. He was not criticizing me to be mean. He was criticizing me to make me a better communicator, and I'm profoundly indebted to him for that. And 20 years later, I'm still going over some of the stuff he taught me. This has been a really good review for me. So one more, this one from January 12, 2002. Good bridge from scary movie to scary times of the moment. I went back and looked at the sermon, and again, it has to do with transitions. I spend an inordinate amount of time in preparing a sermon on transitions. I want to make sure my transitions have precision of language. I know how I'm going to get from point A to point B. If point A, I'm telling a story, there's room to sort of respond or be impromptu, or there's a little room in transitions and the introduction and conclusion. I always want to know exactly how I'm going to end, exactly how I'm going to begin. And the way I do it, I told you yesterday that I practice it usually 5 times aloud before I preach a sermon. But the way I will do it is I will keep starting over until I get through the whole thing. So to begin with, I will start over 10, 20 times, but then I really get that introduction, and then I try to go further each time until I get the first sermon practice out of the way, and then I do number 2, and number 3, and number 4, and number 5. But I always do it until I just get messed up or whatever, and then I go back and start over. And that kind of ingrained. So I say, you know, if you're going to really work on memorizing and precision of words, think about introduction, conclusion, and transitions. I think that's where it's most important. He said, I said. Sometimes these can be accomplished in other ways. Remember this well, and I do this to this day, thanks to him pointing it out to me. When you tell a story, it gets too wordy unnecessarily if you insert he said, she said, he said, or I said, he said. You don't have to do that. And what he would suggest is, you know, maybe the first time. So the officer pulled me over, and he said, do you know how fast you were going? I said, well, I don't, but I'm guessing you know how fast I was going. You don't have to keep saying, well, yes, as a matter of fact, you were doing, he said, as a matter of fact. If you just you know, almost act it out. Does that make sense? So this is the police officer when I'm talking this way, and this is me when I'm talking that way, and that, you know, does away with the need of always saying, well, he said, and then I said, and he said, and I said. We'll say, so why were you going so fast? I don't know, officer. I just wasn't. I was listening to a worship CD. Have you heard this new worship CD? Not really interested in that. So you don't have to say he said, she. It's clear. And so it just cleans up language a little bit. Vocal variety high. Some infrequent low passages might have employed more vocal intensity. So when you're down pitch-wise, and make sure the vocal intensity is still good. Appearance prima, and then that's comment number 11. And then I noticed comment number 33. He said, new suit, question mark, shirt, tie, they all work. And here he puts appearance prima. So he liked what I wore that day. But again, people notice what you wear. And it makes a difference. Poise, posture, good. Very few tics and fidgeting. And this is another way that he was very helpful to me. He pointed out to me certain things I do that are just nervous, you know, tics or whatever. And so he would work with me on, you know, do you realize you're doing that? I said, no, I have no idea. And in this sermon, apparently I wasn't doing some of those things that he had worked with me on. Note freedom, remarkably good, and as usual. That enabled eye contact with the center and the wings. So again, he makes a note of how much eye contact I make. I tend to, when I'm preaching, pick out maybe 4 or 5 people in the congregation around the room in different places and really lock in eye contact with them. Typically, they are the people that are giving me the best feedback, like they're smiling or their posture communicates, yeah, I'm with you, I'm here for you, or whatever. And so then that is just good feedback. It's not been, so if I have been locking eyes with some of you today and yesterday, it's not because I think you need the message more, quite the opposite. It's because I really like you and I like the feedback you're giving me. So anyway, colloquial language, we talked about this yesterday, it's particularly suited for the younger set, generally good. So that's his way, I think, of saying, yeah, when with college students, speak college language, but don't try too hard. Like, you don't want to try too hard to dress like kids dress or whatever, or to speak like kids speak. Be yourself. Thou shalt be you. That's one of the 10 Commandments. Be yourself, but be at least aware of their world and use their language some. Generally good. Was intro a tad longer than it needed to be as it relates to the length of the whole? The guidelines he gave me on this, he said, I can't really draw it out, but he drew out two pyramids, and basically, though, the point was, he said, you want your introduction to be no more than 10% of the sermon. So 10% or less, generally speaking, maybe 5%. And if you're typing out a manuscript, it's pretty easy to see what percentage this story is, what percentage the introduction is. He said the close should be about 5%. And the close should recap, challenge, and return to the introduction. So, and then, of course, the body, he says, start with your introduction, maybe 5% of the sermon, and then have a forecast. So that's your transition where you're telling people this is where we're going to go, and then the body of the sermon, and then close it with about 5% of the whole. You held the gaze where you pause, keep at it. So here again, he's big on pausing. This one's interesting, and he wrote, I think, we were talking about this yesterday, but he says, thanks for not wearing a wedding band. That works for many people is my punch. I chose not to wear a wedding band there. I have one, and if I am preaching in a country where it's expected that you would wear a wedding band, then I do. In that Adventist community, apparently, according to his perspective anyway, he felt like it would be kind of a stumbling block for some of the older members. And when you're talking about dress, it's just that anything that gets in the way, you don't want it to get in the way. But it does communicate something non-verbally, and in his estimation, it's good. I obviously, I'm fine with people, preachers wearing wedding bands or not, but I think the point is to be sensitive to the culture. It was interesting, my mom told me, just recently we had this conversation about a well-known Adventist preacher who came to their camp meeting. And she said, and he just wore basically jeans and a t-shirt. And he said he was doing that because he didn't want clothing to get in the way of the message. Okay, well, the fact that my mother, who's in her 80s, is telling me this, clearly for her, to point it out, did exactly what he said was the reason he wasn't going to wear a suit like you would kind of expect at that particular camp. It was a big camp meeting. And he just all week dressed very, very casually. Which, again, it's fine, but don't you want to just do everything you can to erase anything that would just trip people up, right? Whether that's what you wear or how you sort of carry yourself, all of your nonverbals, everything matters. So pay attention to it. Okay, and then he liked long gaze when I paused. Have you considered bridges to illustrations? This was a bit stark. A few years ago, Sheree and I took a vacation. That's something that I definitely started doing back in the 90s and early 2000s because of Dr. Dickinson. And now I think I do it pretty much without just thinking about it. But he's talking about getting into introductions, that it's good to lead into it, to connect it, to bridge it. Apparently in this sermon, I made a point, and then I just, boom, started the story, which doesn't work as well as it just takes a little bit to sort of bridge it. So you might say something like, I love the words of Phil Yancey on this, or this brings to mind when Sheree and I were in Mazatlan, Mexico, or let me put spin on this for you. So you just kind of give people a heads up that I'm going to tell you a story that relates to where we were just at. Does that make sense? Okay, so, all right. Bridges, all right, we're almost done here. It's sincere, pleasant at parts, intense at others, clear, somewhat empathic, somewhat pleading, unequivocal. They left you more time. They left you more time to preach today. So apparently the songs or whatever went before the sermon wasn't as long as usual. He says you didn't abuse that. You quit when you were done. Good. And that's another good tip, I think, for all of us, is hopefully you're done at the same time they're all done. And you end at the same time. And with that, I feel like this would be a perfect time to sort of take a break. I think I'm done, unless you want to spend a couple of minutes, not long, but a couple of minutes just responding or sharing or asking a question.